today is so exciting because I finally am trying oil ground. So if you don't know what oil ground is, you're not alone. I was also like, what the heck is oil ground? That just sounds weird. But it's essentially a primer for oil painters. So if I'm sure if you're an oil painter, you know all about gesso, acrylic gesso, which is what most people use as, the first layer on a painting. And it helps bind the paint to the canvas. Acrylic gesso works great. You can use it as an acrylic painter or as an oil painter. However, I recently have learned all about oil ground, and essentially it's like gesso, but it's only for oil paint, and it's supposed to help the oil paint stay more vibrant because it's less absorbent. Acrylic gesso is very absorbent, so a lot of your oil paint is going to kind of like soak into the gesso, and then your colors will look dull and kind of faded, and you'll see like dry spots, and it just doesn't look as vibrant as you want it to be. And I've had this problem for a long time. I'll have these oil paintings that I did like a year ago, and I'll look at them and they just look flat and dull, and the colors are so not bright anymore, and I get so frustrated, especially if you're selling art. Like, that's important for your paintings to be archival and stay beautiful for a long time. So I was reading about oil ground, and it's less absorbent. That means that your oil paint is going to stay on top of the surface instead of getting sucked into the primer. And I've heard that your paints can look brighter and more vibrant for a long time. Basically, we're just gonna try it out. We're gonna compare it with regular, acrylic gesso, compare the application, the drying process, and the painting process, and then of course what the painting looks like after. Okay, so we are ready to try out the oil ground. Also, you can thin the oil ground with Gamsol if you like. I am not gonna do that because I just don't like using solvents when I don't have to. And with the first layer of oil ground, I heard that you wanna do like a really thin layer, and you wanna do like 2 or 3 coats. So I think we'll do a thin layer first, let it dry until it's dry to the touch, and then we'll do 1 more layer before we paint. I have no idea what I'm doing. Okay, we opened it. We are capable. We are brilliant. Okay, so I'm just gonna use my palette knife, and I watched a video on Gamblin's YouTube channel, and they said to just do a really thin layer first. So that's what we're gonna do. They also said you could use a paint roller and roll out the first layer if you wanted, but I don't really feel like looking for my paint roller, so we're not gonna do that. I'm just gonna try to get it as smooth as I can with the palette knife. So far, I really like it. It feels like a higher quality gesso and just kind of feels luxurious, probably because I'm thinking about the price. I think this small can was like 20 or 30 bucks. I can't remember, but it was not cheap. If you're a painter who likes to paint on large canvas, it's definitely gonna add up for sure. So, that is just one thing to consider. I may not always want to spend a ton to get the nicer items, but if it works great, I'm really willing to spend more because things are gonna last longer and look better, and you can charge more as well because your paintings are higher quality. So quality is very important when it comes to materials, but again, we cannot let our budget or our financial means define us. So if you only have the budget for gesso, then gesso it will be. Oh, and also you can put oil ground on top of acrylic gesso. So, canvas paper and store-bought canvas often comes with acrylic gesso already primed on it. So that's fine. You can just put oil ground on top of that already. Also, I do recommend using ventilation because there is a strong smell. I can definitely tell that it's giving off some fumes. Okay, we are looking pretty good. I'm just gonna smooth this out as much as I can, try to get out any little lines. I think we are in business. And the next step is we just want to let this dry, and like I said, ventilation is important. Just gonna open this, get some air flowing. I also have this like box that I'm gonna use just to put it over the painting. Make sure there's no like crazy dust. I need to wipe this out actually. And just plop it on top of the canvas paper. And we will let that dry for like 2 days until it's dry to the touch. Now we are going to try out the acrylic gesso. Okay, it is time. We are ready to go ahead with the acrylic gesso. I have my Liquitex acrylic gesso here, and gesso dries really fast, like within a couple hours. So we just want to work quickly and, smooth it out just as we did with the oil ground. I can already tell that gesso is so much thinner than oil ground. It's a very big difference in texture. It's really interesting. It's not as satisfying, I would say. I think that's why I've always been drawn to oil paints, because there's something so satisfying about the thick lusciousness of them. Don't get me wrong, acrylics are amazing and they're very affordable, they're easy to clean up, they're just kind of more doable, especially if you're a beginner, and there's a lot of pros. But you can kind of tell that they are that cheaper plastic material. I mean, they literally are made of plastics, but there is something about the oil ground that I really liked, just the thickness of it. Normally with a painting I was gonna sell, I would sand the gesso layers and all of that to make it really smooth, but because I'm not gonna probably sell this painting or anything, it's just an experiment, I'm not gonna sand anything, we're just gonna get it as smooth as possible and call it a day. Okay, and I'm just gonna make sure I don't mix things up. So I'm gonna put the acrylic on the left, and I'm just gonna make a note so that I know which one is which. Okay, well that is all for now. We're just gonna let these dry overnight, and then we'll come back and check them tomorrow and see how they turn out. Okay, so the acrylic is definitely dry, and oh wow, the oil ground is fully dry also. So that means we can go in with the second layer for both of them today. All right, it is day 2 and layer 2. And we're gonna get started with the oil ground. So we're just gonna do another fairly thin layer. We're only gonna do 2 layers because that's enough for this small canvas. And the second layer is definitely going on easier because we have that foundation layer. It just really smoothed things out, and all of the grit from the canvas is kind of covered up already. So it's just going on really nicely. There's no resistance, and yeah, I'm just gonna try to cover up any little dry spots that I see. Okay, we're looking pretty good. It's not perfect, but I think that looks great. It's good enough for what we need it to be to see the effect that we're going for. All right, time for gesso, day 2, layer 2. Gotta love a squirt bottle, Gesso just goes on so easily. It just feels like water almost because it's so thin. I mean, there are probably thicker gessos out there for sure. This is not the cheapest brand. It's also not the nicest one. It's kind of a mid. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. And I, of course, got gesso all over me somehow. Okay, we have our little pizza tray here going in the oven. Okay, so it is about 4 days later, and my 2 canvas are dry and ready to go. So the next step is we're going to paint some flowers on, both canvas and see how they compare, what the differences are. So I'm really curious to see what happens. So let's dive into the painting. Well, we are finally at the end of our week here, and it is time to finalize our thoughts on oil ground versus acrylic. So what is the verdict? Let's go over a few pros and cons, and then I'll kind of sum up my thoughts and let you know sort of what I think I'm gonna use going forward. So a few pros and cons. As far as price, obviously oil ground is more expensive. However, I feel like the small can will go a long way because it's very spreadable, but acrylic is definitely a more budget-friendly option, let's be real. As far as like experience goes, which to me is important, like I want to feel like a product is high quality and it has a good experience and it feels good, the texture, all of that, I would definitely say oil ground absolutely wins. Like it's not watery, it's really thick and luscious, and it just feels like a solid product. I can tell that it's doing a really good job. Whereas acrylic gesso feels a little bit more cheap and watery. So experience-wise and quality-wise, I would say the oil ground definitely won that category. Let's talk about application. So this is probably where I noticed the biggest differences. With gesso, I would say the application is a bit watery. As the canvas was drying, the edges were curling up a little bit and just sort of waving the paper. Whereas with oil ground, it really had a weight to it and it was a little bit more thicker. So I liked that it kind of weighed down the canvas and kept it straight and really just felt like a solid foundation base. Whereas acrylic gesso, I feel like you need maybe a few more layers to get the same effect. One pro to acrylic gesso is there's not as much of a smell. There was a little bit more of a chemical smell with oil ground, so you obviously do need ventilation for both because there can be like formaldehyde or different chemicals in the air as they're drying, but there was less of a smell with gesso. Okay, so when it came to using oil paint on top of the dried layers, there was a difference in how the paint went on the oil ground. I felt like there was this smoothness with the oil ground, like I just felt my paintbrush sort of gliding with the oil paint on top of it, and like I said, it kind of just felt like everything was sealed up. I didn't get any of the grooves from the canvas. I just really enjoyed how smooth the oil ground felt under the oil paint. With gesso, it's fairly smooth, but I definitely felt it was a little bit drier. Like you kind of have to put a little bit more oil paint and work a little bit harder to spread it around. Especially I don't use a lot of Gamsol or oils. Like I use a little bit of safflower oil, but you might have to work harder to sort of spread the oil paint around. Yeah, so it's like slightly more dry than the oil ground. Now, as far as drying times with the oil paint on top of the two canvas, it's about the same. They're both pretty dry after it's been about a week. Maybe the oil paint on the oil ground version dried a little bit faster, but again, it's hard to tell. They're both pretty dry. And then, final colors. Again, like I didn't match the colors exactly perfect. I kind of just wanted to see like vibrancy and how much was getting absorbed, not necessarily the shade of color. So as far as like how the colors are looking, to be honest, there's not a huge difference. Like I really want there to be a big difference, but if I'm honest, like there's not. I think my bias is going towards the oil ground because I really want it to be that, golden ticket, but they look kind of the same, There was this quality with the oil ground where the oil paint just went on a little bit more like painterly or something. So there is like that sort of feeling. The gesso it's a little bit more matte looking. So I will say, yeah, maybe there is a little bit more shininess to the oil ground version, maybe more sparkle, whereas acrylic's more matte. It's hard to say. When you look at the acrylic, you can kind of see like there's these dry spots and there's shiny spots. It looks a little bit uneven, whereas the oil ground, I don't know, it feels a little bit more shiny all over. So that does make me feel like the oil paint is sitting on top of the oil ground a little bit more. But, to be honest, I think to sum up my thoughts here, I don't think there's a huge difference. However, it's only been 1 week. The true test of oil paint is months and months later, years and years later. So I am really curious to see how the colors look in a few months. I'll be curious to see if one like darkens and dulls and loses that vibrancy and those bright colors, and if the other does the same or if it stays more bright. So, we'll have to do a recap later. But to sum up my thoughts, I will just say that I like the oil ground a lot, mainly because of how it feels, the experience, the placebo of just thinking like, okay, this might save me in the end. This might be a little bit more vibrant in 20 years. Just knowing that is, to me, maybe enough of a reason to buy it, However, I didn't feel a huge difference. Therefore, I think because of the huge cost difference, I'm not going to be too precious about always having oil ground. I think it's fine if I use gesso. It's going to be okay. you know, as long as I'm making sure I use artist grade colors and things like that to keep that vibrancy of the colors, I don't think it's like the biggest difference ever. However, we'll see in a few months, and you know, I'm definitely going to be using oil ground a lot more because I loved the experience, the smoothness, and just kind of feeling like a professional oil painter with my fancy materials. Like, I know that's kind of silly, but I like that part of it. So in conclusion, I will be definitely using oil ground a lot more as often as I can afford it. But if I don't have it around, I'm not gonna sweat. I will use gesso, and I'll probably still use gesso as like maybe the first couple layers, and then maybe 1 or 2 light layers of oil ground or something like that to like make it more budget friendly, and just see if I notice a big difference as time goes on, then I'll definitely be willing to switch over to oil ground fully or whatever. I hope this was helpful. I really want to hear your thoughts. You know, have you tried both? What do you prefer? What do you use now? I really want to hear all about it. So I hope you have a great day, and you know, happy painting, happy gessoing, and happy oil grounding to you. I'm gonna shut my mouth when you say what's on your mind.